In North Africa, Sudan's military leaders say they are terminating all existing agreements with the main opposition coalition and will hold elections within 9 months. The announcement comes as the military faces mounting international condemnation for their violent attack on protesters in the capital Khartoum, which reportedly left at least 30 people dead. While the US says it was a brutal attack, the African Union urged other countries to refrain from interfering, though it also condemned the violence. Many people in Sudan are angry that Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates and Egypt are backing the military council.
Sudan's ruling military council has cancelled all previous agreements with the main opposition coalition and called for snap elections. Tuesday's announcement follows deadly violence on the streets of Khartoum after security forces stormed the main protest camp. At least 35 people were killed and more than 100 injured, according to a group of doctors linked to the opposition. It's the worst violence the country has seen since President Omar al-Bashir was overthrown in April, and follows a breakdown in talks between the ruling Transitional Military Council and the Declaration of Freedom and Change Forces Alliance. The military council took over in April, promising a civilian government will be formed within 2 years. But its decision to call an election within 9 months is likely to fuel anger among protest leaders. They've demanded preparations for elections during a longer transitional period led by civilian administration. Speaking on national TV, the head of Sudan's military council said the opposition coalition was equally responsible for the talks ending in deadlock, and said the only way to gain legitimacy was through the ballot box. He also promised a full investigation into Monday's violence. Today, protesters gathered for Eid prayers, as well as to pray for their dead. It is a great tragedy that instead of celebrating, burials are being prepared.
Meanwhile, the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres has criticized Sudan's security forces for using force on protesters in Khartoum. The Secretary General asked Sudanese authorities to open an investigation into the deaths and to hold those responsible accountable. Let's get more on this story from an African affairs analyst and a lecturer at the University of Lagos, Dr. Okwi Okpala. Thank you so much for joining us on Network Africa.
Thank you. I'm Bakari Salah.
Same to you. So what do you make of the Transitional Military Council's decision to get rid of all the agreements with the opposition and to call snap elections in 9 months?
Well, I think they are beginning to abandon all pretenses to decency, and all the time they've been trying to seem as if they are, and supportive of the democratic rights of Sudanese. They've been trying, but meanwhile they were actually sizing up, testing the will of the protesters, trying to weigh them out to know whether they will continue or whether they are testing their resolve. But now I think they are beginning to abandon all those pretenses, especially when it appears that probably they're getting some support from neighboring Arab countries.
Yeah. Well, what effect is this likely to have on protesters? First, the transition was meant to be in 3 years. Now, the protesters have to wait 9 months for a snap election.
Well, I think the protesters were there. I think all along, they suspected that the military they are not really sincere. And that was why they were putting up the pressure, mounting the pressure to make sure that they get as much concessions as they can before. But then the military were also betting them, hoping that over time the internal disagreement between the protesters will begin to manifest, and then they will begin to tire out, and then they will seize the opportunity and impose their will on the people. Well, I think even now, the protesters should at least be able to hang on for some time, and then extract some agreements, some concessions, serious concessions. Otherwise, the whole effort would have been in vain, just like it was in Syria, just like it was in more or less in Egypt, whereby the forces that were supposed to be, they set out to chase away, eventually even rebranded, and came back and then took over power and remained in government.
What do you make of the African Union's response, though? They've commended the violence in Sudan, but it's asking other international countries not to get involved. What do you make of this? Is this the right response?
Well, of course it's not. But then, when you look at Africa, that's the tragedy of Africa. You know, who are the most powerful forces in Africa? You talk about Nigeria. You talk about South Africa. You talk about Egypt. These are countries that are challenged themselves. Even their records, in terms of even their legitimacy, the credibility of their government, and even the democratic credentials of these countries are in doubt. So these are forces that can actually propel Africa to take the right action. But then it's not in their interest for them to say that there is a civilian uprising against a sitting government. They will not want it. The same way, the other countries that are shining lights of Africa, the likes of Tanzania, the likes of Rwanda, the likes of Eritrea and Ethiopia, they are small, and Ghana, they are small countries that cannot really, pressure a government and a junta like what we have than to do something. So that's the tragedy of Africa. What would have, if we had the proper leadership of AU, if Nigeria were standing on a strong moral and legitimate government, and the same thing with South Africa, the same thing with Egypt, what would have happened is that, they will intervene, go there, bring everybody to the table, and mediate between the two sides, and make sure that there is something that is good for the Sudanese people. The decision that is good for them is arrived at. They have arrived at a good decision.
African Affairs Analyst Dr. Okwi Okpala, so much questions, so little time. Thank you so much for speaking to us on this issue on Network Africa.